I'm sorry, the Nemours property. If you ever have an opportunity to go, it's it's wonderful. And to think about 65 species in in early February is really something. So you probably didn't miss very much.
Oh, I think we did miss birds because we hardly stayed to look at the small birds that were in the trees. We were so busy moving from spot to spot. So I think with concerted effort, we could have added at least 15 more.
That's great. That's really great. So good. So were there, did you see by any chance, the last time I was there in December, we had black-necked stilt, which is an odd bird for this time of year.
Yes, that was one of the first birds we saw. Avocets and black-necked stilts were right there beside where we parked. We walked over to the edge there. There were mottle ducks in there, blue-winged teal, lots of tree swallows darting from place to place, and a lot of the usual things you would expect with a brackish impoundment, red-winged blackbirds and grackles and all those kind of assorted birds were in there too.
Great.
So
That's
egrets,
great.
Yep.
So who else has seen good things lately?
Other than a yellow-throated warbler that's coming to my feeder and eating seeds, I haven't had anything other than that female purple finch, which was exciting because it was the first one of the winter that I had seen. I might mention that having a yellow-throated warbler, it might sound like it's a very early migrant, but I think it's more likely an overwintering bird because on our Christmas counts, there were a fair number of yellow-throated warblers reported this year. And the bird at my house actually started coming to the feeder on the 18th of January. So in terms of looking at like global warming and thinking about birds migrating earlier, what we're finding actually is it's not that the birds are necessarily migrating earlier, but oftentimes they're spending places in winter that they haven't done so before. I know a paper published on ruby-throated hummingbirds talked about ruby-throated hummingbirds migrating earlier, but they didn't take into account the increasing number of ruby-throated hummingbirds that winter in the Southeast. So as an ornithologist, I'm interested to really be careful where we attribute a bird as an early migrant versus an overwintering bird that a bird watcher just happens to see around the time you might expect an early migrant.
That's a good point.
I think with eBird and things like that, that's helping us figure out whether they're here all year, because a lot of people, are reporting on those things. And you see, I'm looking at site I belong to on Facebook where people are taking pictures, and it's astounding the number of painted buntings that are seen all across South Carolina this winter by practically everybody that's got a camera and a feeder in their backyard.
Yes, in this,
like they never left.
In this recent survey of Baltimore Orioles, how those numbers have increased dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. It's just absolutely remarkable. Of course, people are putting food out like oranges in grape jelly and so forth for them. But it means that for a lot of these birds, if you provide the resources for survival, they may well not migrate. They're not hardwired, so to speak, to migrate if food is available.
Yeah. Baltimore Oriole was one of the birds that we got yesterday. And I didn't see where they'd put anything out for them. They were just hanging, they said hanging out about in the pecan trees that they had. So, but in our neighborhood, we're actively putting things out to keep them here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the, I guess in the state DNR's Baltimore Oriole survey, I mean, last year was a record year for South Carolina. So, we'll see how that's going. So actually, I think that's probably a really great segue in terms of what we know about birds and how they're getting to where they're going. You know, I'm really delighted that we have Dr. Gauthreaux with us today. As you know from reading his biography, you know, his extensive experience has included tenure at LSU, as well as Clemson University, as well as University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, known in ornithological, you know, circles as one of the foremost pioneers in the field of radar ornithology. It's interesting, I first got to know of Dr. Gauthreaux through various Audubon contacts, and am friendly with 3 people who were his students over the years, and you know, heard a lot about you know, Sid this and Sid that, and you know, long before I ever met him, which was on the board of Audubon South Carolina. But you know, I've had the pleasure of hearing Sid present on, you know, on a few occasions, and I think you'll find it tremendously rewarding. So. Hey, Sid, David Mizrahi says hello, by the way.
Oh, great, great.
I was on the phone with him earlier today. So,
all right.
That's good. So I will turn it over to you and Susan Murphy, who's managing the Zoom today. Thanks, Susan.
All right. The first thing
everything looks good.
Okay, Susan, but I occasionally get in unstable internet coming up on my screen. So
okay, that's still coming. We can hear you now.
Okay, I rebooted and I hope that helps a little bit. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is what the basis of my current research. I've been invited to submit a paper on this very topic. Of using an upgrade in technology of weather radars that we all depend on. And core to that paper is the title of this presentation: How Dual Polarization Weather Radar Can Be Used to Distinguish Between Weather, Birds, and Insects in the Atmosphere. Does everyone have a full screen like they're looking at my slide? There's nothing being blocked on the slide. Is that correct, Susan?
Looks good from here.
All right, great. It's hard for a bird to migrate in the United States without being detected by weather radar. What you see in this slide is the distribution of these, and the WSR stands for Weather Surveillance Radar. 88 is when the first functional unit was placed in Florida, and D stands for Doppler. When I actually started my work, there were only 50 weather radars scattered across the United States, and that radar was called the WSR-57. The first one that I worked with was placed in, I was a freshman in college when I first went up there and said I wanted to use that look to see if that radar was picking up birds. And it was spring migration. And the individual who had impressed me up to that point in migration was George Lowry, who ultimately became my major professor at LSU. And George Lowry was the inventor of moon watching to study bird migration, to quantify bird migration by looking at the silhouettes of birds crossing the disk of the moon. Well, what I did for my PhD at LSU was looked at weather radar, this earlier version, the WSR-57. It wasn't a Doppler radar. And I discovered that the Weather Bureau radar observers were measuring the intensity of rainfall by looking at how much energy was being bounced back to the radar from these rain showers. And I got the brilliant idea that, well, birds are nothing but big packets of water, and one should be able to see migrating birds on radar. Well, to make a long story short, I actually was able to calibrate the radar using the techniques that I used that to talk about the intensity of bird migration. There was great skepticism on the part of the radar meteorologist until I took them up on the roof when we had a full moon and it was a good migration, and they were able to see these silhouettes of birds crossing the moon. Prior to that, they called a lot of bird displays anomalous propagation. And those were fancy words for saying they really didn't know what was producing the echoes on the radar screen. And after being with them, subsequently to that, they would actually on nights of heavy bird migration report the birds migrating. So it's probably the first meteorologist that weren't giving updates on weather as much as they were giving updates on bird migration. Now we have, and most of you are probably aware of Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology's birdcast system, where they're taking this array of WSR-88D radars that you see their coverage patterns here on this slide, and they forecast based on weather variables of what bird migration ought to be occurring in what areas, and then verifying that with radar. So if you haven't gone to the birdcast website, just put one word, birdcast, Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, it will take you to the site. And it'll start up probably around the early part of March and will continue through probably the early part of June. And then they'll start in August and go through the early part of November. But this slide shows you what the radar beam covers in terms of, and you see VCP12, that's a volume coverage pattern. But if birds, most migration is occurring below 6,000 feet, and you can see that orange color in the middle of the scale, how far out from the radar you could actually, how high the beam is at 6,000 feet. So it's, except for the west, where you have blockage by mountains and so forth, it's almost impossible for a migrating bird not to be detected by the radar beam. And that's important because now we've worked with the system enough that we're able to really use it and talk about the total volume of migrating birds in spring and fall. We've come a long, long way, and now we can start to use it to see not only patterns of migration across the United States, but in the early minutes when birds are taking off to begin their nighttime migration, one can actually see the geographical areas that these birds are taking off from and find out where these hot spots or these important migration stopover areas are occurring. So from my early studies with the WSR-57, the whole field of radar ornithology has advanced tremendously. Let me say a little bit about these volume coverage patterns as we go through the next few slides. What you see here is the weather station with the dome, the white dome covering the actual radar. That's what the outside of the WSR-88D looks like. And if you see this huge antenna, it's an incredibly sensitive radar. This radar probably is sensitive enough that it could pick up something like a Blackburnian warbler about 40 miles away from the radar. So very little passes through the radar, and you'll recall between birds, insects, and precipitation. Well, we'll get to that, and you'll appreciate that by the end of the presentation. The early WSR-88D transmitted its electronic signals in a horizontal polarization, and this cartoon shows what's meant by that. The wave orientation was horizontal, and that didn't make much difference because raindrops are sort of spherical. And these are volume coverage patterns. This happens to be volume coverage pattern 12. And what this means is the radar sweeps 360 degrees at a half a degree, then it kicks up to another altitude, and 12 would be all of these different elevations of the antenna. That would be one volume scan. And in clear air, that volume scan takes about 12 to 13 minutes. But when there's precipitation, there are actually fewer levels sampled, and they do so quickly. Because if a tornado is forming, they want to get updated information pretty quickly. So they don't go through this whole routine of all these different scans. They scan lower scans and then quickly update again. Now, the original WSR-88D had three important moments. It had reflectivity, that's the energy coming back from scatterers in the atmosphere. And you can hear me use the term scatterers. A lot of people early on started using the terms for any kind of target. They call it a target. And that's because the radars originally were used for military. And so they either wanted it where the radar was locking on an aircraft to shoot it down, or they were worried about an aircraft coming in and dropping bombs or whatever. In fact, the very first discoveries of radar ornithology were made in England when the Defense Department thought they were seeing German bombers crossing the English Channel to come into England. But bombers never showed up. So they were wondering what's going on. And they called in ornithologist David Lack from the Edward Gray Institute. And David Lack was very familiar with these movements of lapwings, these larger shorebirds coming across the English Channel just at the time the Defense Department was seeing these echoes. So that's really the first observation of birds on radar, where an ornithologist could actually confirm that these echoes were coming from birds. But more recently, we are trying to get away from using the term target. We're talking about different types of scatterers. There can be meteorological scatterers in the atmosphere. There can be birds. There can be bats. There can be insects. We get scattering of radar waves from chaff that airplanes are dropping to confuse or to camouflage radar signals and the like. But this diagram shows you the original three variables: reflectivity, the energy coming back to the radar, backscatter to the radar from scatterers in the atmosphere. Then there's the velocity, the radial velocity. And you can see here that this scale on the x-axis is radial velocity. The curve you see here is the sum total of the energy coming back from the scatterer to the radar, and spectrum width simply represents the variance in that velocity. This is what an image looks like on the WSR-88D as far as reflectivity is concerned. And what I'm trying to do this afternoon is give you some appreciation from the original three variables to the new variables that are available. And what you see here, this is a radar image from September 28, 2014 at 02:57:25 Greenwich Mean Time. And on that date, we're still in daylight savings time. So that time would actually be 4 hours ahead of our East Coast time. So if it's 02:57, almost 03, you'd have to subtract 4 hours from that, and that would be our local time in daylight time. The mass cursor, this is the location of the radar. And what you see in this area of reflectivity is produced by biological scatterers in the atmosphere. This is typically what precipitation looks like. And if you start to go up from this scale, the intensity of the precipitation increases. The next image that I'm going to show you is the velocity image. This is going to give you the speed and direction of scatterers in the atmosphere. And one thing to remember about Doppler, and you may recall hearing something about how the frequency of a train changes, a train whistle changes as it's approaching you and passing you and going away. Well, that shift in frequency is called the Doppler shift. And those shifts can be measured by the radar and consequently talk about the speed of the scatterers. So the green you see here are all negative values. That is representative of incoming Doppler velocities, and the red or warm colors are Doppler velocities going away. When birds are flying exactly perpendicular to the radar beam, notice this gray right here. It's oriented like that. As you go a little higher in the atmosphere, it's oriented more like this. That's when the bird shows no radial velocity. That is, think about the radar beam and the bird is flying perpendicular to the radar beam. The birds are going this way, and when they get velocity moving towards the radar, therefore it's a zero radial velocity. The nice thing about this is even a quick glance at this image, you can tell the direction of bird migration. It's coming from the bright green and going to the bright red. And the velocities are true velocities. So if you know what the wind is at the altitude where these targets are moving, if you know the wind direction and speed, and the radar is telling you what the direction and speed is based on radial velocity, you can tell whether the targets are flying at the speed at which birds fly compared to the speed at which insects would fly. And in my early publications of using WSR 88D to study bird migration, that was the only way that we really had any basis for telling whether we were dealing with birds or with insects. And if you look at this out here, the reason the purple is there is those are ambiguous velocities. You go too far and you get into where there could be two possible velocities, and the radar codes these as unknown and colors them purple. But we do have some return from the precipitation out here, and look at the velocity, the precipitation velocities of these targets. And then finally, there's a product called spectrum width that I showed you in that diagram, which is the variation within a resolution cell of the radar. A resolution cell, what is that? Well, you have a radar beam, and that's pretty easy to imagine what that's like. And then you have range bins in that radar beam. And originally they were like 1 kilometer segments in 1 degree. A 1 kilometer by 1 degree was a resolution cell or resolution volume. When there are different speeds in that resolution volume, that's what produces spectrum width values. So now if we look at the precipitation, most of the values here are close to 0 if you look at the scale in the precipitation. But look at all the values here. Some of these values are all the way up into 18, almost 24 in sections. And the reason for that is that within a resolution volume, you probably have insects as well as birds. And within the resolution volume, there may be very different types of birds. You could have a Blackburnian warbler, but you could also have a great blue heron. So that produces different speeds within that resolution volume. And so some authorities say, if you get these values 6 and above, you're probably not dealing with precipitation, you're dealing with some kind of biological scatter. So that was the state of the art from the WSR 88D when it was first introduced. Like I said, the first unit was deployed in 88. I first worked with the WSR 88D in Houston, Texas. It was the first Doppler radar, WSR 88D, on the Texas coast. And that was back in 92. It took that long for the radars to start to be deployed across the United States. So from 92 all the way up into 2013, we were dealing with this kind of information to study bird migration. But like everything, they designed the weather radar network to be upgradable. And the two upgrades that had an incredible impact on studying bird migration in the atmosphere was, the first was super resolution. Originally, that WSR 88D beam was 1 degree in the vertical and 1 degree in the horizontal. But since 2008, the radar beam was 1 degree in the vertical, but through processing of the data, they were able to get a resolution of 0.5 degree in the horizontal. That actually meant that you could see details with that 0.5 degree horizontal resolution that wasn't visible when it was 1 degree. 1 degree sort of averaged lots of distinct patterns that you could pick up in the 0.5 degree. And then by the summer of 2013, one of the most important upgrades occurred, and that was dual polarization. You'll recall that the 88D only transmitted in horizontal polarization up until the summer of 2013. But dual polarization was added to the WSR 88D, and now half of the energy coming out of the radar was polarized vertically, and you can see that in the pink here, and half was polarized horizontally, which you can see in the gray here. That's a raindrop. And what's interesting about that raindrop is that it's not completely spherical. And that happens because as precipitation, as rain gets harder, the drops get bigger, and falling through the atmosphere, they cease being a sphere like small raindrops and become sort of oblate. And that's what you're seeing. So that using dual pole radar, you can start to get information that you couldn't possibly get with the system before it was dual pole, while it was only monopolarized. Now, with the dual pole radar, we have 3 completely new products that are available to meteorologists as well as biologists. The first is differential reflectivity. And I'm not going to go through a lot of details. The resolution is 1 degree by 250 meters. So we have high resolution. But the interesting thing about differential reflectivity is best shown to you in the next illustration. If a scatter is spherical, you get just much energy returned to the receiver of the radar by the vertical portion. It's equivalent. But suddenly, if you have larger raindrops that become a little oblate, now you're going to get more energy coming from return by the horizontal portion of the polarization compared to the vertical. And if they're vertically oriented, you're going to get more return from the vertical portion of this dual pole beam compared to the horizontal. That's going to be very, very important in terms of identifying particularly insect return in the atmosphere, as I'll show in a minute. The next of the three new variables is correlation coefficient. And what correlation coefficient is, it's providing a measure of the consistency of the shapes and sizes of targets, shows a higher consistency in the size and shape of radar scatterers or targets, while a low value of correlation coefficient indicates greater variability in shapes and sizes. The important thing about this particular product is that it's used to help distinguish between meteorological and non-meteorological targets. And I'll illustrate that in a second. And the third and final variable that dual polarization provides, I'm gonna just jump over this. There are no units in correlation coefficient. It goes from a value of 0.2 to 1.05. The third variable is a very important variable called differential phase shift. And this variable provides information about the sizes, the shape, and the orientation of scatterers within the radar resolution volume. And it can have a value ranging from 0 to 360 degrees. Now, what you see here, backscatter differential phase, that is, I mentioned the previous variable is differential phase shift. Backscatter differential phase is really the energy coming back to the radar, and the receiver is looking at the shifts in the phases of the waves from the wave hitting the scatterer to the wave coming from the scatterer back to the radar. And let me show you what I mean by that. Look at this wave going out. Let's say this is the wave going out to a bird here and the radar's on the left. The radar's on the left, the bird's over here, and this is the wave going out. But the wave coming back has a phase shift. You can see where the peak is shifted. So what is the degree of that shift? Well, in something like this, it's a 90 degree. These waves are 90 degrees out of phase. This one could be the one going to the bird. This red one could be the one coming from the bird back to the radar. And that shift is measured in degrees, and that has incredible importance in discriminating birds from insects in the atmosphere, birds from precipitation in the atmosphere. So phase shift, differential phase, is an incredibly important polarimetric variable, and it is the basis for really making the radars dual pole. This is what differential phase looks like, and I'm showing you the same movement that I showed you with the legacy variables, the radial velocity, the spectrum width, and the reflectivity. This is differential phase, and you can see that the values of precipitation are fairly low. They're near 1 or 0. And then you get a mixture of values, some of them up in 3, 4, 5, where the biological scatterers are. If we go to the next product, correlation coefficient, remember what I said was great about correlation coefficient? You could tell the difference between precipitation and biological targets. Look at the colors in precipitation, and then look at the colors in biological scatterers. And I point out that there's still little showers occurring amongst these biological scatterers here. And then in the next product, the differential phase product, this is what it looks like. But note the difference in color of precipitation compared to the biological scatterers. And you notice the little specks of precipitation are still greenish, low values compared to the biological scatterers. This information is so incredibly important, and that is the reason Congress was able to appropriate the funds to take these radars from the simple Doppler radars they were to make them dual pole radars. Because with dual polarization now, meteorologists can look at these scatters in the atmosphere, and you see the list of possible types of meteorological scatterer. Everything except the first one, which is biological, birds and insects, and ground clutter. Everything else is some form of precipitation. And you see RF down here is range folded, and that was the purple I showed you before in that velocity image. So now there are classification schemes that have been published in meteorological journals talking about the values. If you see certain values in combination, it's got to be wet snow or dry snow. It can be heavy rain or light rain. It can be big drops or small drops. It can be grapple, which is soft ice and snow pellets. It can be hail, ice crystals, and the like. Well, let me show you what that looks like. If you go to the site at the College of DuPage, here, College of DuPage, Next Lab. Actually, go right now on your computer and look at the current radar. It'll show you a map, and you can actually see, if you go down to classified scatterers and so forth, it'll show you what the classification is. And of course, that classification is in all of this kind of maroonish color, BI, those are biological. So in an instance, we can look at what is precipitation, what type of precipitation, and we can also look at whether it's precipitation or biological. And a lot of that is actually based on the correlation coefficient variable, as well as the differential phase variable. And as you saw in those earlier pictures, the colors between precipitation and biological were pretty dramatic. But you notice I'm saying biological. Biological indicates that there's more than one type of scatterer up in the atmosphere in a lot of these displays. And in 1998, this is very, very early on, and it was measured with an experimental WSR 88D that was dual pole. Dusan Zernick and Alexander Rizkov published an incredibly important paper talking about observations of insects and birds with a polometric radar. And in that paper, they showed a diagram that is very, very significant to the work I'm doing right now. ZDR, that means differential reflectivity. That's one of the dual pole variables that talks about shape. Remember what we said with ZDR. If the targets are more horizontal than they are vertical, you get higher values of ZDR. So this mass you see right here in the image is mostly insects. And they validated that by pointing out that during the daytime, where you don't have lots of birds migrating in the middle of the summer, most of the activity that's up in the atmosphere are insect activities, and that's how they generated these measures. But these measures over here, where you see the orientation being more vertical, those values are differential phase values. This is backscatter differential phase. That's what the Greek symbol is indicating. And it's measured in degrees. And notice that if we go over on the scale and look at the top of the insect scatterers, 50 degrees represents sort of the maximum differential phase you can expect from an insect scatterer. Now there's overlap in this zone between insects and birds, but all of this stuff above 50 degrees really represent bird scatterers in the atmosphere. And that was determined by looking at nights when in the fall, in October, when there were good bird migrations taking place. that's what the data, how the data were generated. Now, let me say something about this variation here. These low values that you see here that are overlapping the insect values, when birds are migrating, remember we talked about velocity. When they were perpendicular to the beam, they had no radial velocity. Well, in differential phase is measuring size. So let's say we have all bobolinks migrating in the atmosphere. When the radar beam hits a bobolink side view, that bobolink has the maximum radar cross-section. It's producing the greatest amount of reflectivity coming back to the radar. But what happens when the radar beam is looking at the tail or the head of a bobolink that's going to fly over the radar station? It no longer is looking at a side view with its maximum reflectivity. It's looking at a head view or a tail view. So that size, the apparent size of that scatterer becomes much smaller and drops into the range of insect sizes. Now, where would rain be? Like small raindrops. Small raindrops, backscatter from small raindrops is near zero. So that is how, first of all, you can separate using differential phase precipitation from biological scatterers. Well, this was published in '98. Another paper in 2013 was published by Jiang in dipolometric data to identify bird contaminated Doppler velocities. And the reason they wanted to look at this was they hoped that your winds aloft so that pilots would get better information about winds, and they could get it anytime they looked at the radar. Well, that turns out to not be the case because migrating birds bias those velocities and make the winds measured by the radar to be faster than they really are, because they're not looking at passive plankton in the atmosphere that's being picked up by the radar and generating wind velocities. They're looking at things that are moving at 25, 30, maybe 40 miles an hour. So it's falsely identifying wind speeds, and this input into the meteorological models, sometimes they would put up warnings for potential tornadoes early on, and it wasn't real wind at all. It was simply birds biasing the wind speeds. So being able to discriminate migrating birds from the presence of migrating birds is critically important to accurate meteorological forecast. And that in this study in 2013, this is what they discovered. ZDR again, this is differential reflectivity down here. And this is differential phase, DP. And you can see that at zero, there are things below zero, and there are lots of things above zero. In fact, the main part of the mass is really above zero. And if we go over to this diagram looks much more horizontal. It doesn't have that incredible vertical extent. And if you look at the legend, you're going to find out that this figure 1 was measured at night migration, and this figure over here was measured near midday when mostly insects were in the atmosphere. This is a better diagram. Remember the Zernick and Rizikoff diagram? We said that most of the insects, if you look at differential phase, were below 50 degrees. And you have obviously things that are going below here in this category. This category, the orange color, are bird scatterers, and they actually, some go below 50, but the fact of the matter is a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're looking at the head or the tail, and up here they're looking at the broadside. Well, last year, I published a paper with my colleague, Rob Deal, talking about the discrimination of biological scatterers in polarimetric weather radar data, opportunity and challenges. And what we found, we looked at different types of aggregation, biological versus precipitation, and we generated statistical models called binary random forest models, but were verified in terms of their identification. And so when we lumped all the categories of biological, that included insects and it included all types of birds, we accurately could predict biological to biological with the model, 98.7. And sometimes it would report it as precipitation, but the error rate was very, very low, only 1.3. As far as precipitation was concerned, sometimes precipitation was classified as biological, 2.2%, but most of the time it was categorized correctly at 97.8. I'm not going to go through the medium aggregation, but I want to go down here because that's really the point I'm making. How do we separate insects from birds? With respect to that, vertebrates were characterized as vertebrates. And the reason I'm saying vertebrates is we had some bat samples and we had bird samples, but vertebrates were characterized 94.3% of the time correctly and only 5.7% of the time as arthropods. And although we took aspects of the scatterers, head view as well as side view. So a lot of this misclassification of vertebrates versus arthropods is in that overlap zone that I showed you in these earlier diagrams. For arthropods, sometimes they were classified as vertebrates. Why? Because depending on the direction the bird is to the radar beam, sometimes they show very low radar cross sections and match the size of like a big moth or something like that. But arthropods were accurately classified 92.7% of the time. This table shows you the types of scatterers in our study. Swarm represented mayflies emerging in wetland areas and rivers. And those, and the next highest category is 3.9. Sometimes they were classified as migrating insects. What we were able to do is when dragonflies are migrating in the atmosphere, we took samples of those and so that we knew known insects, but there were these insects here are basically migrating insects. These are emerging insects from wetland areas. What about the migrating insects? They were classified correctly, 87.9. And interestingly, where insects and birds overlap, the next highest category were purple martins in their roost, leaving roost sites. Waterfowl, 71% for waterfowl, but the next category represented trans-Gulf migrants. Now in the spring, trans-Gulf migrants arriving on the northern Gulf Coast, you obviously can pick those up with the radar very, very well. But the thing about trans-Gulf migrants is, and a lot of people don't appreciate this, a lot of the bird watchers don't appreciate it actually, because most people think about songbirds, tanagers, orioles, thrushes, warblers, vireos, yellow-billed cuckoos, black-billed cuckoo, coming across the Gulf. But what they don't realize is there are tons of migrating cattle egrets, there are little blue herons, there are terns that are migrating across the Gulf, tremendous numbers of shorebirds in differing size flocks and so forth. So the thing about trans-Gulf migrants, it has a real mixture of birds. And some of those actually are waterfowl, like blue-winged teal migrating in the spring. So that error rate for waterfowl is not nearly as high because there are lots of things in trans-Gulf migration that are also waterfowl. And if we look at trans-Gulf migration, the percentage goes down. It's 59.4, and the next highest value is 18.7. Purple martins, they're correctly classified 68.8, and the next category, trans-Gulf migrants, because they're birds in trans-Gulf migration that look very much to the radar like purple martins. And in fact, some of them are probably purple martins. Free-tailed bats, 82.5% of the time, the radar correctly classified bats, free-tailed bats as free-tailed bats. And look at the precipitation, 96.2% of the time, the algorithms, the statistical models correctly classified precipitation, and only 1.7% waterfowl. So if we go ahead and going through that. If we go ahead and look at this diagram here, the one on the right, arthropods versus vertebrates. And I want you to look at the variables. These variables are plotted as their relative importance in discriminating different types of scatterers. Look at this one for arthropods. It's right off the scale. And this is our study with known scatterers, and it has nothing to do with the two papers I just talked about. But what is the variable that's most important there? The gold color, differential reflectivity, the ZDR. And you recall in the earlier diagrams, that's where the scatterers were along that axis, insect. And if we go over to vertebrates and look at what the highest scatterer we see there, or the highest variable, green is differential phase. So in a very different analysis than the one by Zernick and Rizikov, or the one by Zhang and his co-authors, we're able, with a totally different study, to show that those two polarimetric variables, differential reflectivity and differential phase, are critically important in discriminating up in the atmosphere birds from insects. This is an image of a differential phase product. You can see differential phase here on the left. And this was taken on the 15th of May, 2015 at Dallas, Texas. You know from earlier picture of a differential phase that this green is precipitation. And the rest of this represents biological scatterers at this point. But if we go ahead and filter this image, that is, we only show data that has a minimum value of 106. Now that 106, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it should represent bird return in backscatter. You can see that all of these yellows, which are below that, have been filtered out. Yellows in here have been filtered out, and yellows in here. Those yellow values that you see here are the values of insects and head-on and tail-on views of birds. What's left here represents more of the reflectivity surfaces from birds when flying perpendicular to the radar beam. And this is where I'm going with this whole study. And this is the paper we're getting ready to publish. In 2011, a colleague of mine in Europe, the means of analyzing WSR-88D radar data in bird migration. He didn't have polarimetric radar. He only had the classical variables of reflectivity and radial velocity. And he was able to develop, by looking at speeds using the radial velocity to try to identify birds and discriminate from insects, he was able to develop algorithms. And those algorithms, the program was called BioRad. And so what you see in this plot, and I have 3 years of plots, these are the figures for migration reflectivity. That is reflectivity coming from birds. That's why this says mean bird reflectivity. And it's based on cross-section, square centimeters per cubic kilometer of atmosphere. The more birds in the atmosphere, the more reflectivity. And if you look at the dates here, you can see a very nice pattern of where the peak of migration is occurring in early May for Dallas-Fort Worth. All these 3 years, the data are from Dallas-Fort Worth. But the point I want to make here is his approach using Biorad, which is in the orange, and the approach that I'm using differential phase to identify birds' reflectivity. Look how close the results are to each other. And what I've discovered is in cases where I'm getting higher values than he gets, it's because he's only looking 35 kilometers out from the radar, and I'm looking at the whole display of bird migration. So if you see a blue dot above an orange dot, it means that migration might have been much heavier, let's say west of the radar station, beyond 35 kilometers. And his analysis method doesn't show that, can't show that, but the dual pole filtering method of looking at bird reflectivity picks it up. So that's the year of 2014. This is the year of 2015, and you see some real deviations right in here. But if you look at these deviations, where the radar was located out towards the west, you started picking up a lot of movement there. Hence these dual pole approaches of measuring migration showed much higher reflectivity than the Biorad approach. And then the third year, you can see the same thing. The important thing about this is he's uncertain what was insects and what was birds, because sometimes using the radial velocity, you're not getting a very clear-cut picture. But with the dual pole variable, differential phase, you can clearly discriminate what's a bird in the atmosphere now from what's an insect. And there is overlap, but if you don't look at those data, if you filter those data out and only look at above 50 degrees in that backscatter, you're looking at mostly birds. And with that, I just want to summarize the points I've made in the presentation. That the technological upgrades, the enhanced resolution and dual polarization to the WSR-88D are not only very beneficial, let me go ahead and reduce this, for the classification of different types of precipitation in the atmosphere, like dry, wet, snow, hail. But these upgrades are extremely useful for discriminating different types of biological scatterers and reflectors in the atmosphere. And there are two dual pole variables that we didn't have in the original 88D. These dual pole variables of differential reflectivity and differential phase have proven to be best for discriminating between insects and birds, and also discriminating between biological and meteorological scatterers in the atmosphere. What does this mean? It means we're much better able to forecast bird migration events for birders and bird banders. And the military is interested in these results because we're now more accurately able to determine bird movements that pose hazards to aviation in comparison to heavy insect return being displayed on radar. Prior to this, if you've got a big display of reflectivity on the radar, there's some analyses that have been in the literature where they talked about that being heavy bird migration. And when you look at the speed of the scatterers, it didn't show that that was the case. And now with differential reflectivity and differential phase, we know for certain whether we're talking about a major insect movement or a major bird movement. And with that, I'll show you a typical sunset picture for the end of a presentation showing you the radome and the tower for a WSR 88D. And if anyone has any questions or you need additional explanation, let's do that right now. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll go back and put my full pictures up again. All right. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Kay Grinnell has a question. You mentioned using velocity to ID birds. Are there additional methods you use for bird ID?
In terms of radar data?
Yes.
Well, originally, that's all we really had available. You could look at seasonal patterns and the like, but the speed of a migrating bird exceeds the speed of sort of the fastest insect. There's a little overlap. Some of these big moths that migrate approach a speed in the atmosphere in calm, let's say a calm atmosphere where there's no wind assistance. The greatest speed of a moth will overlap the slowest speed of a bird. Like a kinglet and a moth might have very similar air speeds. So it's important to be able to know what the wind speed is, because the radar is not discriminating air speeds, it's discriminating ground speeds. So if you're going to use speed like Doctor did in his method of getting rid of insect return, he had to know winds aloft and the altitudes that the birds were migrating. With the dual pole approach, you don't have to worry about that. So it's very, very interesting to see that the dual pole results are coming up very close to the method using speed and so forth to identify birds. But they have difficulties in terms of discriminating precipitation, because as all of you know, some precipitation in terms of looking at radar displays, the speeds can be quite strong in thunderstorms and the like from winds. And yes, birds will fly through thunderstorms. We can actually see what's going into a thunderstorm on radar, and we can see what's coming out.
Thank you. Other questions from the group?
Hi, it's Susan again. Could you talk about MODIS towers a little bit, and would that information gathered be totally separate from what you're doing, or is that integrated?
Actually, it's not, because I attended a session last night from Charleston, Audubon, where we had a discussion of MODIS towers. We had a presentation on MODIS towers, and the study looked at migrating sorrel rails and a few Virginia rails that had MODIS tags on them. And the idea behind MODIS towers, for those of you that may not be totally familiar with it, is you have a tower that's receiving very specific signals coming from a little nano tag that's placed on the bird. And that nano tag has a little antenna on it, and it's transmitting a signal. And when that bird flies in the vicinity of a MODIS tower, the MODIS tower can record that very bird. So it's just like bird banding, but instead of a band, you're putting a nano tag. And instead of actually looking at the bird and saying, hey, it's got a band and I've read the number, the MODIS tower is actually recording the signal and decoding the signal to identify that very bird. So we were looking at the patterns that MODIS is showing. And keep in mind, with MODIS, you get a hit at one tower, and then you go 500 miles farther south and you might get another hit. And on some of these things, he was getting his first hit and east of DC, And then the next hit was in South Carolina. And you have no additional information. All you can possibly do is draw a line. But what he did was he looked at wind directions and found out that these birds, although it may have started in Maryland and was recorded in South Carolina, that bird probably went offshore from Maryland, went out over the Atlantic, and then came back in on the South Carolina coast. And he showed how wind patterns would accommodate that. But of course, there are no, other than Bermuda, there is a Motus tower at Bermuda, and they do get birds off of the Atlantic coast that go out over the Atlantic and are recorded in Bermuda. But that's not a common pattern. And of course, everyone knows that soar rails have been recorded in England. So we know that some soar rails that are over the water actually cross the Atlantic and get to England. So the problem with Motus is that in order to really get the kind of information that would give you more detailed tracks, you got to have a load of Motus towers scattered all over the United States. It's a grid. And, and the light lights up when the bird's over that grid cell. And I think that's a possibility. And we're now getting enough Motus towers strategically placed that I think will fill in those gaps. It won't be point A and point B. We'll start to see more details about the tracks. But in the meantime, we're also getting better and better by putting a transmitter on a bird and having a satellite pick it up. Martin Wikelski now has on the International Space Station a receiver that can actually pick up signals from relatively small birds. It's no longer eagle-sized birds or swans and ducks. It can be a robin-sized bird, and in some cases, maybe even a bobolink-sized bird that this receiver on the International Space Station can pick up and then retransmit back to Earth and be decoded. And so they're getting incredibly detailed pathways of migrating birds through this International Space Station satellite receiver. And in South Carolina, Audubon is getting ready to put up an array. I'm part of a group, Nemours Wildlife Foundation is involved. Audubon, South Carolina is involved. And we're trying to get other local Audubon groups to rally around the flag, so to speak, so that we can promote this network of Motus towers in South Carolina. Our coast has a pretty good number of Motus towers, but what we're trying to do now is go up the interstate so that any bird going southwest would have to cross a line of Motus towers going from the coast up to like Greenville.
That's actually a great update on Motus. We had plans to locate a Motus tower here on Hilton Head Island. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has slowed the process down considerably, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that we'll be able to revitalize those efforts soon.
And John, we were going to do the same thing for Edisto, but again, the problem is that we were thinking about the state park, and we have a pretty good idea of where these should occur. One ideal place is to put them on these old towers that they had volunteers sitting up looking for forest fires, because these towers project well above the forest canopy. You've got to have that antenna high because you can't have a lot of vegetation blocking the antenna, or else the bird has to basically be over the antenna to be received. So the higher you can get that receiving antenna, the better. And so that phase now is almost complete. We're almost getting partners that would agree to have a tower on their structure. Or the Forest Service is looking into it to see if some of their old fire towers could be used and the like. So it's pretty exciting. And what's nice about that is that once we get that array and more people are able least know it's within the range of the tower.
There's a question. This is Susan again. We have a question from Lynn. Can you identify what size class the bird is, like herons versus warblers, or can you just tell the difference between a bird and versus an insect?
Well, that variable differential phase, you can actually, we're exploring that possibility right now. We have known insects and we have known birds. And what one would predict, if differential phase is a good indication of size, we should be able, in known birds that are migrating, like for instance, if you hear geese flying over and you're looking at radar and sampling on a night of good goose migration, you know what those sizes are. Then look at the differential phase values to see if they agree. So we're in the process. That's sort of the next step in some of the work I want to do. And that is to be able to document all the way from a small raindrop, which is 0 differential phase, all the way up into migrating swans, which should be a much higher value of differential phase. Because remember, what's the largest insect that migrates that you would pick up on radar? Probably a big moth or a big dragonfly. Those are probably the two largest insects. But compare that to a ruby-crowned kinglet or a ruby-throated hummingbird. There's a little overlap in that size, but I'll bet you those values are very close to the transition, but like 50 degrees between an insect scatterer and a small bird, a large insect scatterer and a small bird scatterer. And so some of that accounts for that overlap that you saw in those diagrams. There are some birds and some insects that overlap a little bit. And things like large dragonflies sometimes are dominant in the atmosphere. There are nights where you have large dragonfly migration that's just as impressive as a major bird migration. And because it's occurring at night, most people don't know about it.
Okay, thanks and good luck.
Susan, do we want to read Avery's comment?
Sure. Avery Young is commenting, I'm a current graduate student of Dr. Aborn. Very
Yes.
glad to tune in today.
I saw that
Excited
David
for,
was on the presentation. I saw his name at one point.
yes, he's very glad to tune in today. Excited for the conservation possibilities of this kind of large data collection using technology that already exists. Thanks so much.
All right.
And speaking of this technology, are you still getting good support and funding from the Defense Department?
Actually, I don't need it, to be perfectly truthful. I'm retired, and with money always comes some conditions where you have to do regular reports and everything else. All this radar data is free. Very easy to download. There are programs that the government has that you can use to analyze it. And so a lot of my research is sort of grant-free at this point, and I can take more time to do the research and data analysis as opposed to writing these progress reports that they require.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed this very much, and I hope that you go to the Birdcast site and look at that, because I think you're going to find that fascinating that we now have an eye on bird migration across the United States. When I was just getting started, I approached the Weather Channel to give reports on bird migration when there's no weather occurring during spring and fall, but they weren't interested because I wasn't coming with a sponsor. They thought it was an interesting idea, but they figured that they weren't going to do it on their own. I had to get a company to sponsor that project. And now we don't have to worry about it because Cornell, through funding they've secured, they now have a pipeline to get the updated data for all the radars in the United States, process the data, process the meteorological data, produce forecasts of bird migration, and then verify it with the radar. So finding a dream I had has come to fruition.
Sounds great.
Terrific.
Thank you. John, any last words?
Yeah, well, just following up on that last comment, within the next few weeks, it's going to be really fun to look at Birdcast because we'll start to see what's coming our way.
And if you don't want to look at Birdcast, there are places, like I said, the College of DuPage, the Next Lab. You can go ahead and look at real time. It has a map of the United States. When you go to that site, look for NextRad, and you'll see dual polarization radar. You can get a map of the United States, tap on the Charleston radar, and actually look at that product that classifies weather versus biological. And very soon, really warm evenings, you start to see incredible waterfowl migration. And of course, the folks that are at places like Savannah Refuge, they correlate that pretty well. They say we really had a drop in our waterfowl numbers. And of course, you look at radar the night before, and you can see a tremendous exodus coming from these areas on radar. So although Birdcast does a lot of the work for you, looking at the radar yourself, based on some of the things I presented this afternoon, that's an awful lot of fun too.
That's great. And, we certainly want to thank you, Sid, for spending time with us today. And I want to thank you for your ongoing work in this area, and also for your work up in the Ace Basin in Edisto with the land preserve. So, it was really a pleasure to have you this afternoon. Want to remind folks on the call that we are in the middle of our annual nominating process. If you have any interest in coming on board and serving with us, I would encourage you to drop me a note, or drop Jane Hester a note, or Kay Grinnell, and we'd be more than happy to chat with you. So bear that in mind, and like the slide says, stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next month.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye, and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.